Hi, my name is Brian Sheil. I'm a music producer. I work with many different artists, songwriters across Ireland. I'm in my final year here at Wimbledon Recording Academy, doing a music production degree course. And also of interest, I also have my own radio show on RTE Pulse, which is Ireland's national broadcaster. Okay, so the project that I chose for my thesis was, I entitled my own project, Blast from the Popular Past. And the idea was that I would present myself limitations that were presented to producers and engineers of the day during the 1980s. In particular, ballad production, that was the type of style that I wanted to go with this. So, for example, what I actually did was I used Pro Tools solely as a tape machine. I used Destructive Record. I had limitations, i.e. 24 tracks, and limited myself. I had no plugins. And I really was focusing on performance, which I don't think is really focused on today's 21st century productions. My inspiration for this project was two main practitioners, David Foster and Humberto Gatica. Humberto Gatica during the time was David Foster's engineer, and he was responsible for getting the most incredible of 80s sounds, particularly from keyboards, synthesizers, that type of thing. But also like David Foster, because Whitney Houston was probably the biggest selling artist of the time, and also the one that the DX7 had the most influence on popular culture. So he was my main influence and inspiration for this production. There's a massive difference between the role of producer nowadays and during the 80s, which I really experienced during this project Blast from the Popular Past. For example, with the limitations that I had 24 tracks, I had no auto-tune, I had no Command Z, Control Z, whatever you want, the undo button. I found this to be more of a performance-orientated production, and again, that was the big thing in the 80s. They captured great performances, they captured the moment. Where nowadays, you can do multitude of takes. You have plugins, you have different processing, and it's much more easier nowadays, I found. But also, it made me really think about the actual decision-making process. It's not. You have to think carefully about, is that the right take? You can't go back to the multitude of tracks that you've taken the day before with a certain artist. You need to actually, live the moment and be in the moment of, is this the actual take they want to use for the final master? I really think in today's world, and particularly during my experience of recording as if I was in the 80s, that we may have just thrown the baby out of the bathwater. And what I mean by that is, yes, today we have Pro Tools and Logic, and we've lots of tracks, we've auto-tuned, lots of plugins, but also quality has suffered. But when I say quality, I really mean performance. Again, that was the thing in the 80s, and that's the thing I actually experienced, and I was very attentive to the performance, particularly not just of the vocalist, which the audience really are just listening to the vocalist as well as keyboards, bass, drums, whatever. But just my attention to detail, it really increased, and I think that really improved me as a producer. Particularly now that I'm in the 21st century and I can use what I learned through this process in today's world, basically. The song that I chose was an original song. I wanted an original song because I wanted to really experience what it was like during the 80s to record an original song. So I approached many of the songwriters and composers that I worked during my past, previous clients of mine. And I chose one composer and one lyricist, and the reason I chose this specific lyricist is because I wanted credible lyrics. The composer was also used to playing keyboards, the drummer, bassist as well. They're all used to what the 80s music actually sounded like. But also, which is very important, and I wanted to stress this point, I wanted somebody who was used to recording and being in a recording environment, because again, the idea of this is to capture performance. So before we went actually into production, we had a rehearsal period. That it was 2 or 3 sessions of just rehearsal, because again, what went through the mic actually came out on the record during the 80s, so I wanted to experience that as well. Okay, so after we chose the song, we went into the pre-production stages, which basically means to find the sounds that we're going to use on the Blast from the Popular Past production. The emphasis of this song was ballad production, and I really wanted it to be keyboard driven. So I researched all the main synthesizers used during the 1980s, and the biggest one that was used was the Yamaha DX7. So I had to source the Yamaha DX7. I researched it, and I found out there was a Mark 1 and a Mark 2. I chose the Mark 2 because it was stereo, it had less noise and less hiss, and also it gave me a fuller sound, particularly for the presets that I used. Full tones, hard tones was mainly the big preset that I use for, particularly like it's David Foster inspired, Whitney Houston, that type of thing. That was the type of keyboard sound that I went for. But also my vocalist had to be very credible in the way he delivered his performance. And also because we're in the 80s, I threw in a saxophone there as well. Okay, so after the pre-production stages led me on to the production stages, which meant for me as a producer to find the right equipment to record and produce this song. So I researched many of the mics that were used during the 80s. I used the AKG 414 because Sting used that in 1983 for Every Breath You Take. I also used the Avalon preamp, which was made in 1986. Because this was a ballad production as well, it was very reverb orientated, so I had to source many of the Lexicon reverbs. And again, this was mixed on the Neve VR Legend, which was one of the prime desks used during the 80s. And of course, after I had this mixed on the Neve VR Legend here behind me, I took 2-track straight out of the stereo bus on the Neve straight to Pro Tools. So again, there was no fixing, there was no auto-tune, and there was definitely no second chances. There wasn't the Command-Z undo button. Okay, so the challenges that presented themselves to me and what I actually found difficult was, number one, I had to use my ears more because again, as I've said countless times, it was about the performance. There was no second chances. I was using destructive record, which I was never ever used to. So that was a big challenge. And also the amount of tracks that I used is 24 tracks maximum. That was a big challenge because I'm used to big tracks, big sessions, Pro Tools Logic. But also, which is an interesting fact, is the recall. I can recall in the 21st century, I can recall a mix. I had to mix this in a day and I had to know when the potential was reached for this actual mix, the production, the performance, the musicianship. So that was one of the biggest challenges I found during this process. Okay, so one of the things that I learned, that the biggest thing was to use your ears more. That was the biggest thing that I learned throughout this process. But also performance and getting emotion across to the listener, because nowadays it's the producer or the engineer fixing things. During this process, the artist had to deliver, the musicians had to deliver. So I'll be more, let's say, strenuous on performance nowadays in my productions, but also aware of just little things like the art and detail, attention to detail and what's actually being recorded. Because we have, again, it's the baby in bathwater situation, because we have 50 tracks, I've learned it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get the best performance. So again, I had to have lots of attention to detail on the tracks that I was actually using, which ones were the actual ones that I'm going to use for the master as well. Again, things like reaching potential, when to actually decide, yes, that is the take, thank you very much vocalist, you can come out the boot now. Things like that. What I also learned during this process was the value of relationships with the vocalists, with the musicians in the studio, because during the 80s, yes, the producer was the head guy. He was in charge of the budget, he was in charge of performance, the engineer was in charge of the technical aspect of the full thing. Nowadays, the team is Logic or Pro Tools, the producer and the vocalists, who may not be in the same studio as where the producer is recording. So that was another thing that I actually learned. Having great communication skills, having great organisational skills, musicians turn up on time, because I can't recall the mix, time is money, you know the story. I've worked really hard on this project, but as with every project, particularly during my course here at Pulse, I would change some things. If I could go back in time, what I would change, I'd probably spend more time at the rehearsal with the musicians. Not that I didn't spend enough time with this project, but I would like to have maybe explored more options, maybe have more time to explore with different sounds, go through the full keyboard sound, because during this process I had an idea what I wanted in terms of the full time sound on the Yamaha DX7, on the Yamaha PSR 6300, which was one of the other synthesizers that I used. But also one of the main things that I would like to do again, if I had to do it again, is to record this on tape, use a tape machine, go ultra 80s. So finally, thanks very much for watching this documentary. I really hope you enjoyed it and you've learned something from this. I know I've learned lots of different things from this project. But just one final point before I go. During the 80s, there was no such thing as Command-Z, which is the shortcut for undo. They had great engineers, great producers and great performers who didn't actually need Command-Z, the undo function. So my question to you is, why exactly do we need it now?